Welcome to My Business Matters, the Michigan Chamber podcast.
Hello, I'm Jim Holcomb, President and CEO of the Michigan Chamber, and today's podcast host. We're going to be talking about free enterprise today, the threats it faces, and what the business community can do and must do about preserving it. Our special guest and expert today is Neil Bradley. He's the Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer, and lead for Strategic Advocacy for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And I can tell you there's no one more invested or knowledgeable on this topic. Neil, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jim. It's an honor.
Well, why don't we start just a little bit of background for our listeners. How did you get to the U.S. Chamber?
You know, I grew up in Oklahoma, in a small town, and my parents were both small business owners, and I got the opportunity to go away to college in Washington, D.C. And then all of a sudden I found myself interning on Capitol Hill, and then one day you wake up and you've been there for 20 years. And after 20 years in government, I found my way over to defending the same businesses like my parents' small business across the country. And that's been a real honor.
Well, that's great. And it seems like, your story is the same as everybody else. We all grow up. We know people who own a business, whether it's a family member, a friend, or just the ones we shop at and utilize throughout our daily life. And unfortunately, business seems to be under attack right now. Yeah. And not just businesses, but the actual premise and the actual philosophy of free enterprise. And it seems to be something that we really need to get a hold of and make sure we're protecting for future generations.
Yeah, that's right. We haven't always in the U.S. kind of embraced the free market system that we've known really for the past 50 years. We had a pretty good stint where we had a really activist government, and the government regulated in really minute details, all the way down to setting prices, big swaths of the economy. And it turned out that that's not a really great way to grow an economy or create wealth for families and to increase wages. And so we've been the beneficiaries, really since the late 1970s, of an approach that empowers markets and the collective decisions that we all make when we decide to sell or buy something in the public square, in the market square. We've been the beneficiaries of that. And now there are people both on the progressive left and the populist right who say, well, wait a minute, maybe I don't like what the free market produces. Maybe it would be better if we used government to direct more directly the outcomes of businesses and services and what all of us think of as free enterprise.
What do you think is driving that? When I talk to our members, people across the state, it seems to come down to the word fair. Everybody has their own definition of fair, whether that's a price or how long it takes you to get a product or how long a service lasts, anything. And I'm trying to figure out how the government is going to be better positioned to determine that than what the markets are. The consumer can make their choice of what they want to buy and what they want to utilize.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think a lot of it does come down to this argument of fairness. And to your point, it tends to be in the eye of the beholder, right? Mm-hmm. Like what I might think of as fair, you might look at the same way and say, that's completely unfair. But of course, most people don't think that way. They think, well, great, if I think something's fair or something's unfair, and I can use government to kind of produce that outcome, wouldn't that be a good thing? Of course, that's not the way it works, right? And so what you end up happening is when government decides what is fair and unfair, what you really have is government picking winners and losers. Mm-hmm. And government's just not very good at that. And the markets, it's like the old Winston Churchill saying about democracy. Democracy is the worst form of government except for every other type that mankind has ever tried. Free markets aren't perfect. Yeah. It's the worst form of organizing an economy except for every other one that we've ever tried.
And it also, though, it has a track record. We built this country on it. Yeah. We've shaped the world on it. It's really driven innovation and entrepreneurism and really raised the standard of living for a lot of people around the world.
Around the world. Like, if you think about the trajectories just in the last 30 years about global poverty, the people who are living on $1 a day, we have slashed that. Global illiteracy, we still have about 9% or so of the global population that's illiterate. But we used to be in like the 40% range. And even if you think about it here, at home, like workplace injuries. We've cut workplace injuries dramatically since the 1970s. Not because someone created some government bureau that was saying workplace injuries, but because people innovated and they created new safety devices, and we've just made it easier and safer to work.
Yeah. Now, you and I, we're talking to business leaders all the time and job providers. What do you think the general public thinks? Do they understand the concept of free enterprise, let alone being a champion it? Do they really understand what it is, and how do you think they view this discussion?
Yeah, I think most people are busy living their lives, right? And so, they're going to work, they're raising their kids, they're involved in their community. But when you stop and you ask them about it, and you ask whether or not people should make decisions in the marketplace and the market should decide, or whether we should have government making these decisions, they're pretty quick to say, no, not government, please. Now, I think it's true that people often don't use the same language that business leaders use. Maybe they don't use the language that you and I use when we're talking about free enterprise and free markets. But at its core, they kind of understand that the idea that they want to live in a world where businesses are working to meet their needs. Yeah. That where, if a disease needs cured, that they can have some trust that someone's working on a cure to provide it. In a world in which you wouldn't have choices, businesses creating choices. In a world in which you're not interconnected, that businesses are creating those forms of connection. And I think they intrinsically understand
We seem to have lost the notion, too, that business is good. Everybody wants to demonize them. It's kind of sport to criticize businesses now, or that making a profit is somehow bad. Businesses are building our communities. They're employing us, friends, family, neighbors. They employ me. And I'm wondering, what do young people think? They're the ones that are going to be the next generation. They're going to have to take this argument and figure out what to do with it. What is either polling or what does your research show that they think about it?
Again, they don't talk about it the same way we do. We undertook a project a couple of years ago, and we had people who were coming to us and saying, that the kids these days, they're all socialist, et cetera. And we're like, is that really true? And what we found was that they're not. That freedom and choice are really important, maybe even more important in terms of the emphasis. Yep. So they don't use capitalism in common conversation. They do use freedom. They do use choice. They don't tend to think about markets the way we do, or kind of allocations. But I'll tell you an example that was pretty heartening to me. We had a focus group, and it was this one happened to be college-educated millennial and Gen Z women happened to be in this focus group, and they were having a conversation about housing and healthcare and food and all the things that all of us complain about the costs of, and the difficulty and accessibility. And the conversation was turning to, well, shouldn't the government have a more active role in guaranteeing everyone housing and healthcare and shelter and all of these things? And initially the conversation was, that seems fair, to your point about fairness earlier. And then all of a sudden this one young woman kind of got this look on her face, and she said, I don't know, this reminds me of those group projects in college. And you remember those, and there was always a guy, and it's almost always a guy. There was this one guy, he was in our group, the professor put him in our group. He didn't do anything. He didn't even show up to the meetings. And he got the same grade that I did when I was humping it, making up for the fact that he wasn't doing anything. This kind of feels like what we're talking about, that I'm going to work really hard, and someone's going to take that and give it to someone else. And you watch the whole room shift. Like, that's what's unfair.
Yeah, there's a visceral reaction to it. It's amazing, when people look through different lens, they get to the same point. It's just the path they take to get there. And it seems to me I think a lot of people look at it and think more left to center or far left, but the whole sense of populism seems to be the right and the left now on the extremes are, they're both kind of looking to the same ideals or the same process, and they're taking us down a road where I really fear for the middle class, because they're the ones getting kind of squeezed out here.
No, you're exactly right. And at its core, both the progressive left and the populist right, at its core, it's about power and the idea that we ought to use the most powerful institution that we have, which is government. Government is the most powerful institution. And we ought to expand its power to make society the way we believe society ought to look like. And progressives and populists often have very different ideas about what they think society ought to look like. But the common notion that you should use the power of government to do it is kind of what ties them together. Of course, when you do that, the power that you're taking is the power away from free citizens and markets, and the idea that each of us voting with our feet and with our dollars are really going to decide what society looks like. And so, the most powerful kind of force at the end of the day actually isn't government power. The most powerful force is the collective decisions that we make in either rejecting some product or service or demanding some product or service.
And that's what's scary to me, because I think you're right. It's about the power of the decision maker. But I fear that especially our young people are getting bombarded with messages. It doesn't matter what you do. The world is stacked against you. You can't make it without government helping you. And the only way to do it, and it'll be a Republican or Democrat, others in the middle, saying, just vote for me. I'm the only one that can handle it. And we're perpetuating this myth that it is government, even if they don't think about it from the standpoint of free enterprise, just the general notion that government has to make the decision or else I can't win or be successful.
No, that's exactly right. I mean, listen, we've seen what happens when you take that to extremes, right? Like you and I grew up at a similar time, and I still like to tell the story of the Yugo. The Yugo was a car manufactured in Soviet Yugoslavia, and it was a real hit in Yugoslavia. People loved the Yugo. Turned out someone had the bright idea of trying to sell them in the United States, and we have the freedom for people to do that, to be able to import them and sell them. They weren't exactly a hit here. And people were like, well, what's the difference? Is it American preferences, or is the Yugoslavian people have different preferences? Well, it turns out in America, we actually have choices. And it's easy to have a hit car in Yugoslavia if the government has decided that that's the only car anyone has a choice to buy.
Yeah, and that's one of the best things. Like you said, it's that word choice and giving people personal freedom for whatever product or service or good that they want to buy, that it's available. So business is under attack. What does business community need to do? How does the business community fight back against this trend or this philosophy that's out there?
I think there's a couple of things we have to do. First, you got to recognize that it's occurring. That sometimes we tend to look at a discrete policy issue or debate that's going on, and we don't put it in the larger context. I think we have to put it in the larger context of what do we mean by a free market and how do we preserve a free market. By the way, not every business succeeds in a free market. A free market means also the ability to fail, and that's what to have success. You have to have the opportunity for failure, and we have to become kind of evangelists for that mindset and remind people of the core principles that are at stake here. I think that means getting a little bit louder. Listen, I think for 40 or 50 years, we didn't really have to have this debate because there was a pretty broad consensus that, of course, markets are better than government. We would never want to return to the days of trusting government. That's not the case today. So we got to get in the arena. We got to go talk to, I don't care if they have an R, a D, an I, you can put whatever initial you want after your name. We need to be talking to those folks and saying, listen, this is what free markets have been able to deliver. This is why it's important. This is why it's a core value. And here's why we have to defend it.
Yeah, and finding the messages that work that come through the...
Absolutely.
How did this come about? Is there an individual pushing this, a group? Is it just a political movement that's the genesis? How is this coming about, and why are we seeing more of it now?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mentioned that we weren't always so kind of free market oriented. And, you don't have to go back very far, the early 1970s, in which, governments told airlines where they could fly to and how much a ticket cost. And government set the price for shipping things. And we had tax rates at 70% for, pass-through businesses, small businesses, like crazy, economic policies where government actually set prices and wages out of Washington. And what happened was, beginning in the mid-1970s, a bunch of people left, right, and center said, you know what, this government-directed system doesn't work, and we need to empower market. And it was a kind of an organic intellectual movement, and it was think tanks, and it was shows on PBS of all things, and then elected officials from both parties ended up kind of picking it up, and we had this revolution. The folks who disagree with our free market system have actually went back and studied that and said, well, let's just replicate that in reverse. And so let's fund a bunch of scholars at universities, at think tanks. Let's fund media to cover what they're writing and what they're doing. Let's incubate and train politicians and candidates and staff, and they're trying to create their own movement. They're well-funded. If folks look up the Hewlett Foundation, they have a whole playbook online, and they and others, according to the Chronicle of Philanthropy, have put about $500 million.
$500 million?
$500 million, $500 million towards the goal of, some of them call it reimagining capitalism, some call it finding the new consensus. The thing that they almost all have in common is they talk about it in terms of a political economy. So they want to take the economy and import politics into directing the economy. I actually can't think of anything worse to try to sell right now. Yeah. So if you like our politics today, let's take that and make it dominate our entire life. Yeah. But that's where they want to go.
In business, in the business world, my members tell me stability is king. Yeah. They can deal with regulation, they can deal with tax structures, but they need stability. You interject something politically, and that pendulum is going to swing wildly depending who's in control at any given moment. We'll never have stability.
That's exactly right. And listen, you're beginning to see that play out at the federal level. Mm-hmm. And so, former President Obama famously said towards the end of his second term, he was frustrated with Congress. His party no longer controlled Congress. Mm-hmm. And he just said, kind of forget it. I got a pen and I got a phone, by which he meant I can call up agencies and tell them what to do, and I can write executive orders and regulations. And that was great, except the guy who followed him, Donald Trump, got the exact same pen and the exact same phone. Yeah. And Trump really went at it. And then Joe Biden shows up and gets the same thing. And this is what happens when you're kind of pursuing maximalist policies, when you're trying to over-involve government, and you really do go guardrail to guardrail.
And I think that's exactly what the public doesn't want. They still believe in schoolhouse rock, that there's a bill and it goes to Capitol Hill and you're doing this back and forth and the president signs it. They don't want one person with the stroke of a pen just, kind of governing by edict.
Yeah, it turns out that one of the reasons that markets work is because it's collective decisions. Mm-hmm. That as smart as I may think I am, and as much as I may think I have my pulse on exactly what people want to buy, it turns out I really only know what I want to buy, right? And it turns out the same is true in government. If I singularly get to decide, I'm not nearly as smart as the collective decision of working through the lawmaking process and having the ideas challenged and being forced to, compromise. And when you do, it turns out you end up with better products and more durable law.
Well, and how much innovation would not happen if you're going down a certain path and nobody's allowed to, innovate and try things on the other side. Those choices are taken away because government says, no, it's only this path. You're going to lose out a lot of.
We're having big debates around this country right now about artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. And it reminds me a lot of the debate in the 1990s about the internet. And thankfully, on a bipartisan basis, Republican Congress, President Bill Clinton, they looked at this technology that people didn't really understand, the World Wide Web and what it would mean. They knew it would be transformational. And they had a choice to make. Do we want some government agency basically constraining what the internet becomes, or are we going to let the market figure out? And they chose market. Today, we have a technology that we don't know exactly all the things it's capable of doing, et cetera. But we have a choice to make. Are we going to choose to let the market bring out the best of it and suppress the worst? Or are we going to trust government? And I think government's going to do an awful job when it comes to trying to manage something as creative and disruptive as AI.
Well, look how many little issues they can't handle. Whether at federal level or state level, there are a lot of issues that never get addressed because government can't come to a consensus, not let alone a compromise, but just a consensus of how to move forward. And as we kind of wrap up some of the conversation, it's going to be a political issue. It's an election year. How does this play out in 2024 in elections? Is it a big issue? Does somebody try to utilize it?
I don't know that it plays out much in 2024. 2024 is so dominated by this kind of rematch at the top of the ticket. I hope it becomes more of an issue that candidates begin talking about, particularly down ballot for Congress, for state legislatures, for governors even. And, listen, I think whether that happens or not, the business community is going to play a role in that. We should start asking candidates, what is your view of the relationship, the appropriate relationship between government and the economy? And I think that would be, I think it would be very illuminating to hear what some of the candidates for office might say about that. And that's going to give us a better debate and certainly is going to produce a better outcome.
Yeah, which is absolutely what we need. We need the better debate to get to the outcome. Kind of last question, what's one takeaway that you would give to business leaders as they contemplate this and how they should be thinking about moving forward in this type of environment?
Yeah, unfortunately, you can't just put your head down and just focus on your business. That if this debate goes in the wrong direction, if we decide that we're going to make decisions that the free market used to make and we're going to put them in the hands of government, then it's going to be really hard for you to run your business, which means that you got to engage now. You got to become part of the debate. You got to participate in the advocacy process before the legislature. You got to participate in the political process. That's not to say you got to be one party or the other, but you need, if someone wants your vote, you should be asking them these kind of tough questions. And if nothing else, you're probably going to make them a better candidate, and if they win, a better elected official.
Yeah, and just developing the relationship so if they are elected, you have an open door and try to get them to be that pragmatic problem solver that we need to solve these problems.
That's exactly right.
Well, Neil, thank you so much for joining us. As always, time goes by so fast. Thank everyone out there for listening. Tune in to our next episode. Subscribe and like to our podcast for easy notifications. And until then, do whatever you can to move Michigan forward.